Campaign 2018 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, Marshfield Clinic, and Campaign 2018 partner Milwaukee Journal Sentinel.
WisconsinEye coverage of the 2018 elections continues. We're at the Brown County Library in Green Bay. Republican Representative Ron Tusler of Harrison is seeking a second term in the 3rd Assembly District. Ron, welcome back to WisconsinEye.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I like to ask first-termers this question. Where do you think you had an impact on your first term in the Assembly? What issues did you work on, successes?
Well, I had a very busy first term, so I was really happy with the output from our office. We had 10 bills that were signed by Governor Walker as a freshman, which I was very excited about. I would say one project that I worked on and helped with the Village of Kimberly was their New Page site. So New Page was a site that basically had gone to ruin and had sat in ruin for about 10 years. Their TIF was up and they had a large payment that was due the state. I believe it was over $2.5 million. And I was able to help Kimberly defer that so that they could spend their money on fixing up the site, which they're doing, and that site is now turning from what looked like a war zone to a residential area that is really going to be a benefit to the community. So that's one specific thing on the ground that I think my constituents can see that I certainly had a large role in. Not the only role, Village of Kimberly did a great job with it. But there's all kinds of small issues here and there that I worked on too. Obviously my recount reform bill was also another big bill that I did as well that I'm excited about. I think it made our elections better.
That narrowed the number of candidates who could seek a recount.
Correct, yep. And it gave some sort of limit. It's a large limit still, but it gave some sort of limit so that not just anybody can ask for a recount. For example, in our last election in 2016, when Jill Stein asked for a recount, even though she was 1.3 million votes behind, that was a recount that clearly she wasn't going to be on top after it was over, when the average in Wisconsin is about 200 votes in a statewide election are flipped or changed when we recount. So.
Okay. Let's talk about issues that, well, let's lead with one that, the impasse on highway funding. You were in those caucuses.
I was.
Back and forth, delayed the budget. Going forward, what's your idea of how to solve the highway funding question?
Well, one of the important thing that I mention at the doors a lot when we talk about this issue is that we have two separate budgets in Wisconsin. We've got a general fund and a transportation fund, and those are different. That's why we had a surplus in one fund and a deficit in another. That's why we still have the transportation issue, even though we had a surplus in our general fund this year. That's something that I don't know that everybody knows, even though you and I are kind of on the same page with that, I'm sure. But basically, regarding that, what to do about increasing that money. So what we're talking about is how do we get more money in that transportation fund? Do we raise revenue? Do we spend less? Do we act more efficiently? That's kind of how you could fix it. And there's only a certain amount of options that we can do to fix that fund. First and foremost is always just to act more efficiently. Anything we can do to be more efficient, to get our roads done faster for less money is certainly something we should investigate. Second is, do we want to raise the gas tax? Do we want to raise registration fees? One idea that, I've proposed that has gotten very little traction so far, but maybe people see the wisdom in it, is making individuals that come into Wisconsin pay our registration fee. While that's not so common in the United States, that's the way they handle it in Europe, is that if you're going to go into, you're going to drive into Austria, you're going to have to pay their registration fee to pay for their roads.
Would it be prorated or their annual registration fee?
Well, that's probably depending on funding and how much money that would come up with and that type of thing. But in Austria, everybody pays the same amount whether you're there 365 days a year or just driving through. So just as an example, but we want to get all the options on the table, but I think we got to pick one. I wish we would have done that last year and would have fixed that transportation budget, but unfortunately that's one that we're going to have to look at next year.
Two follow-up questions. If it was a long-term solution, could you vote to raise a gas tax, number one? And what about the buzz in the Capitol on tolling, please?
Okay. First, regarding gas tax, I'm willing to do that, and I would vote for it. However, you know, we do pay an awful lot already at the pump. I don't want to increase that if we don't have to. But it's kind of a situation where I'm not sure we have a choice, because the money has to come from somewhere to keep that money in the transportation fund. So I would do it hesitatingly, though,
Okay.
and maybe even grudgingly a little bit.
Okay.
Regarding tolls, I don't like tolls. And my problem with tolls is that it's a very onerous tax. So when an individual drives into Illinois, you know, they might drive on the highway for an hour and might spend $14. That's a tax of $14 that is frustrating to that particular payer in a different way, I think, than an increase in gas tax or an increase in registration fees, or, you know, some other, you know, registration fee increase would be. So I think it's just a little bit more onerous of a tax, and I want people to like their state, not get frustrated with it if I can help it.
Our legislators from northern Wisconsin, and I'm going to include Dorr in that, are you worried about your roads not getting fixed as quickly given the emphasis on I-94 for the Foxconn development?
Well, I'm a big supporter of the Foxconn development. I really think that that's a huge advantage to Wisconsin. I think in 20 years we're going to look at it and say this was a no-brainer. And you know, every situation has some risks to it. I appreciate the individuals that are making sure that we're taking these risks carefully, but I think we have taken them carefully. I think we're going to find out that this is good business, and there is some risk in good business. But regarding
Will it delay any of your area projects?
Well, not necessarily in my district, but some in the Fox Valley. And you know, that certainly is not preferable, but when I think about the advantages long-term, I think this is short-term compared to long-term looks. And while business and a lot of legislators are focused on short-term goals, I try to focus on long-term goals. And I think long-term, it's going to be much more beneficial for us to have Foxconn than for us to get any highway project done a year faster.
Let's talk about levy limits. Local governments have existed under levy limits since about 2006. Local government officials, some of them, to use their term, say levy limits strangle, that's their term, their ability to provide local services. Here's my question. Is it time to ease up those levy limits or get rid of them?
Well, I think you have to look kind of at the overall taxation. So it's kind of a taxation question. You have to look at the federal taxation. I mean, how much are we really taking from people's paychecks and from, you know, businesses and corporations, and is that a fair amount? Because that's why we have levy limits. We wouldn't do that if we didn't want to control kind of out of control spending within a municipality, which certainly happens in every state and can happen in Wisconsin. And there's examples of that happening in Wisconsin that really put a municipality in a bad place. And that's kind of another thing we can do. You know, municipal governments change their leadership, and it's very easy for one leadership to spend a lot of money and then they all retire or move on to something else, and the next group gets to try to figure out the math of the mess that was left. So I think it's important to have those levy limits. I think it's always okay to investigate whether they're fair or not, and whether they're set at the right amount. If that ends up being something that gets taken up next year, certainly something I'd like to learn a little bit more about and see if I think it's fair or not. But at this point, tough to say.
When you hear from constituents in the 3rd Assembly District, they must bring up health care. What do you think is the next state steps potentially on health care?
Well, pre-existing conditions. That's something that passed our assembly. It's something that, you know, we really support, and we really believe that this is something that, you know, in the assembly, and I believe is something that people have kind of put their foot down and said, you know, everybody's got to have some opportunity to get health insurance. We can't have individuals that have no opportunity. So I think that's certainly something we should certainly look into, I think that is something I'd love to see Governor Walker sign next year. But that being said, I do also, you know, like to remind people how great Badger Care really is in the state of Wisconsin. I mean, that's some of the best health insurance you can get. And the fact that we have that and it's so easily accessible for so many people in Wisconsin is a huge advantage for those folks that really can't afford health insurance that fit within the Badger Care system.
What about health care in rural areas where the residents are older, their average household income is less than the state average? More and more of the health care comes from Medicaid, Medicare. How do we ensure health care continues in the rural areas?
Well, one of the things we did this year that I thought was a really great idea that came out of the Rural Wisconsin Initiative was a system that encouraged medical doctors that are residents that are looking to set up shop to have some of their student loans paid for by practicing in a rural area. So basically it's grant money that if that particular doctor goes to an area that's considered rural, they can get certain amounts of their scholarships paid for. Such a great idea. I tried to do it with public defenders, which is another need we have in Wisconsin as well, is to try to get individuals, especially in northern Wisconsin, to go up there and practice there instead of paying for, you know, in that particular situation, attorneys to drive all the way up from Madison and pay just astronomical amounts for mileage.
Final question on health care. What should be, should there be state incentives to recruit and retain healthcare professionals as we see more and more of them retire?
I think to a certain extent, yes. Also, I mean, you should be able to, and I mean, healthcare is a little bit up in the air with the finances of it still, but I mean, you can rely somewhat on supply and demand as well. When you don't have enough doctors, hopefully that'll increase the pay and more people will come in. You know, I certainly believe in that statewide, and I hope that that is all that's necessary. But when that's not necessary, when you need a stopgap because it's just not going to happen fast enough, that's when I think incentives might be appropriate.
Let's talk about funding K-12 schools. You voted for a budget that provided an increase in state aid to K-12. Do you think we're going to need a similar, rather large increase in the next budget, or do you think it doesn't have to be that big?
Well, I'd like to see us to continue to focus on increasing funding toward education. So one of the things I was really proud of this year was that my school districts within the 3rd Assembly District received a total of $4.5 million more this year than they've ever received in the past.
In state aid?
Yeah, in state aid.
Thank you.
And that is a huge advantage, I think, for some of our school districts. And our school districts, especially in my area, are really outstanding school districts. They're really outperforming. I mean, they're all doing excellent, but Kimberly is in my district, and that's a school that just keeps on coming up on top, whether it's in athletics or academics or a lot of other metrics. So we've had a lot of success in our area. I really think that it has a lot to do with really caring parents and really hardworking teachers.
The choice voucher program has been expanded dramatically.
Okay.
Should it be expanded more in the next budget?
Yes, but everything within limits. I mean, I think that choice schools have a huge advantage for students because it gives them first an option so they can pick. Second, it gives them an opportunity to, you know, express, you know, whatever their individual interests are. I mean, a choice school in music or a choice school in a particular religion. All of that gives an individual some advantage. So I think some increases are good there, but I think we have to make sure that we're fully funding our public schools too. I don't think the intention ever was to decrease public funding for choice schools. I think it was really to give an extra option and give more opportunity, not less. And I think we've seen that.
Given mass shootings and school shootings, do we need to change Wisconsin gun laws?
I don't think so, no, because I don't think that that is how you solve that problem. So I really think that we took a step in the right direction just a couple months ago when we passed $100 million to help our schools figure out ways to be more safe. See, when it comes to weapons, there's no guarantee that reducing the number of weapons or changing what kinds of weapons are out there are really going to change the availability to individuals of those weapons. So that is kind of a very wide net to catch a very small fish. You'd be much better off if you focused on a smarter way to solve that problem. And that problem, to me, is within the schools. How do we stop individuals from getting into our schools? How do we make it more difficult? How do we have just any sort of options that we can? And the schools are better than we are at determining what's, you know, their need and what will actually make sense and what's an appropriate use of those funds. And you know, is it cameras? Is it better locks? Is it, you know, having ways to, you know, shut off the school? There's all kinds of different options that are out there. And I think we're going to do better for our students if we focus on the actual school districts. And I think when we do that, I think when we focus on making those districts more safe, I think what we're going to get as a result is I think you're going to have other states that are going to look at Wisconsin and what we have done and model their laws based on what Governor Walker proposed.
Future decisions on prisons. We're going to close the 2 juvenile prisons. The Green Bay prison and the Waupun prison were built in the 1800s. Do we need a new state prison?
Well, you know, we've got 23,000 people that are currently incarcerated in the state of Wisconsin. That's a pretty large amount. I'd like to find other options other than making, you know, more prison space, but it's kind of an option. I mean, you can't really run out of space. It's not a very good option to have because it's very hard to say that, hey, this person's supposed to be incarcerated, but, you know, we just don't have the space for them, so I guess they get to go out. You know, you might have situations, you know, that you could have some very big tragedy when somebody, you know, is supposed to be in and all of a sudden isn't in for some reason. In the past, we've used jails to kind of house those extra people, but there's capacity limits to everything. And so would I be in favor of it? If it's 100% necessary for capacity, we really don't have another option. But what I'd really like to see is other programs that help people get jobs when they get out, and you know, lower our recidivism rate. Recidivism is a real problem in the state of Wisconsin. If we can find ways to not just punish people for what they did wrong, but make sure they don't do it again, that's better not just for them, but it's also better for victims too.
What's your position on either legalizing medical marijuana or legalizing recreational marijuana?
Well, I try to keep an open mind on both of those issues, but I would lean against legalization of marijuana or even medical marijuana. And with medical marijuana, I think it can be misused. So basically, you know, before marijuana was legalized in California, you know, I was walking. I've got relatives in the San Diego, Los Angeles area. I'm out on Venice Beach, and I see these little huts, and they say medical marijuana here. And you can go in there, they'll diagnose a headache for you, whatever it needs to get that marijuana, and then they all of a sudden are, you know, right next door you can pick up your prescription for marijuana, and, you know, an hour later you've created a medical record that you've got a history of headaches, and just so that you can, you know, basically misuse that marijuana. And I can't say that 100% of everybody that went through that booth shouldn't have been on medical marijuana, but I'm convinced that the vast majority of the people were probably not using it correctly. So I'd be concerned that, you know, you'd have the similar thing in Wisconsin where things would open up and basically people would be prescribed medical marijuana that weren't really needing of medical marijuana. But that being said, there are definitely some individuals that benefit from medical marijuana. You know, I once met a Vietnam vet who basically said he was on all of these Vicodin. You know, I think he said something like 25 Vicodin a day, and it was just an astronomical amount. But when he used marijuana, he could have 5 Vicodin a day instead of that 25. And it's a huge benefit for him health-wise to not have so much of that being filtered through his liver and filtered through his body. To him, you know, if I could get him medical marijuana without risking people misusing, you know, the medical marijuana, that would be my perfect world. But I don't think we can get there. California certainly didn't find an answer in the way that they did it. You know, if there was a way to get both, I would try. But to me, I'm a little skeptical that it's not going to get misused more than it's going to be used correctly. So I guess that would be my concern. But I do definitely identify that there's some people that really would benefit from it.
Final question, do you want to highlight differences between you and your opponent in the November election?
You know, I don't know my opponent too well at this point. We just had one debate a couple of days ago, and, you know, from appearances, I think he's got his heart in the right place. I think he's a nice person and a good family man, and I look forward to meeting him and getting to know him better as the campaign goes on.
And your top priority if you're reelected next session?
Top priority. Well, I've got a lot of ideas, a lot of things I'd like to work on, but I'd have to say the top priority is probably doing more for our paper industry in Wisconsin. We've got a strong history of a strong paper industry in the Fox Valley and in Wisconsin. It's not just the Fox Valley that loses when we lose our paper industry. You also have some very economically struggling areas up north that would lose their lumber industry. This is an industry that provides an awful lot to Wisconsin. And after meeting with Midwest Paper Group, which is formerly known as Appleton Coated, which is within my district, there's some low-hanging fruit that I'd really like to see if I could chase to try to help that industry and make sure it's profitable and economical, and it's going to be improving instead of decreasing in Wisconsin's future history.
Thank you. Republican Representative Ron Tusler of Harrison is seeking a second term in the 3rd Assembly District. Ron, thanks for talking to WisconsinEye.
Hey, thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.